The paramedics' hands were gentle as they lifted me from the asphalt, but I could see the concern in her eyes. 26 miles. 26 miles and I'd collapsed just 50 yards from the finish line. "Ma'am, can you tell me your name?" she asked, her voice cutting through the roar of the crowd that had gathered around me. "Margaret," I whispered, my throat raw from the October wind that had been battering runners all morning. "Margaret Chin. 82 years old, and I'm lying on the ground like a broken bird." The young woman checking my pulse couldn't have been older than my granddaughter Emma. She had the same kind eyes, the same careful way of moving her hands, the same unconscious gentleness that came from genuinely caring about strangers. But Emma wasn't here. None of them were here. My children had refused to come, convinced that watching me attempt this madness would be too painful, too dangerous, too much like watching someone they loved destroy herself in public. "Margaret, what made you think you could run a marathon at your age?" the paramedic asked, not unkindly, but with the sort of professional curiosity that suggested she'd seen plenty of people make questionable decisions and was genuinely trying to understand this particular brand of insanity. The question hung in the air like smoke from an extinguished candle. What made me think I could do this? What made me lace up those bright blue running shoes 3 years ago when my doctor told me I had arthritis in both knees and bones that were thinning faster than autumn leaves? What made me believe that an old woman who could barely walk to her mailbox without feeling winded could somehow find the strength to run 26.2 miles through city streets in weather that was making 20-year-olds shiver? The answer was lying in a cemetery 2 states away, beneath a headstone that read, "Richard James Chin, brother, husband, father, he never stopped believing." The answer was in the promise I'd made to hands that could no longer squeeze back, to eyes that could no longer see me stumble and fall and get back up again. "Someone I love," I managed to say, watching the medic's face soften with understanding. "Someone who can't run anymore." The crowd began to part as they prepared to move me to the ambulance that was making its way through the maze of barriers and spectators. But I could see it now, that blue and orange banner stretched across the street like a birthday ribbon, the word "Finish," in bold letters that seemed to pulse with every labored heartbeat. So close. We had come so close. I could feel the metal they would have placed around my neck, could imagine the weight of it against my chest, could picture the moment when I would have called Richard's widow Janet to tell her that I had kept my promise. That her husband's faith in his crazy old sister hadn't been misplaced after all. So close, Richard. We came so close to proving them all wrong. If this story is already stirring something in your heart, I'd love to know, what time is it where you are right now and which city or state are you watching from? Drop it in the comments. Let's see how far this story is reaching. Let me tell you how this all began, because the story you think you know isn't the one I'm about to tell you. This isn't a story about athletic achievement or breaking records or proving that age is just a number, though I suppose it's all of those things too. This is a story about keeping a promise to someone who couldn't keep promises anymore. This is a story about discovering that the most important conversations of your life might happen when you're alone, running through empty streets at dawn, talking to someone who can only answer in the whisper of wind through trees. My name is Margaret Chin and I am 82 years old. These hands that are typing this story have kneaded 10,000 loaves of bread, changed hundreds of diapers, and held the faces of 3 babies who grew up to become adults who worry about me constantly. The lines around my eyes map out decades of laughter and tears, sleepless nights with sick children, and countless mornings when I stood at my kitchen window watching the sun rise over a world that kept changing faster than I could keep up with. I have liver spots on my hands that no amount of expensive cream can fade, and my hair has been completely gray for 15 years, though I still color it auburn because my late husband Robert always said it made my eyes look like autumn leaves. I wear reading glasses that hang on a chain around my neck, and I still write letters by hand because there's something about the physical act of forming words with a pen that feels more real than typing on a computer screen. I remember the day President Kennedy was shot because I was in my high school chemistry class when the principal's voice crackled over the intercom, shaky and strange, telling us that something terrible had happened in Dallas. I remember Woodstock because my younger brother Richard tried to convince our parents to let him hitchhike there with his friends, and the argument that followed lasted for 3 days and involved threats to disown him that none of us really meant. I remember the moon landing because Richard and I sat on our front porch that July night in 1969, staring up at the stars and trying to wrap our teenage minds around the idea that human beings were actually walking around up there looking back down at us. These are the markers of a life lived long enough to understand that everything changes and nothing changes all at the same time. The technology advances, the fashions shift, the music gets louder or softer or stranger, but people still fall in love and have their hearts broken and worry about their children and wonder what happens after we die. 3 years ago, I was a woman who had already buried her husband of 48 years. Robert had died on a Tuesday morning in April, quietly in his sleep, the way we had both hoped he would go when the time came. I was someone who had raised 3 children and watched them raise children of their own, who had attended more graduations and weddings and birthday parties than I could count, who had learned to navigate the strange territory of being a widow in a world that seemed designed for couples. I had learned to cook for one person after decades of feeding a family. I had learned to sleep alone in a bed that suddenly felt enormous and empty. I had learned to make decisions without consulting anyone else, to come home to a quiet house, to eat dinner while watching the evening news instead of discussing the day's events with someone who cared about my opinions. My days had settled into a comfortable routine that revolved around small, manageable activities. I gardened in the mornings when my energy was highest. I read library books in the afternoons. I called my children on schedule and visited my grandchildren when invited. I attended church on Sundays and played bridge on Wednesdays and went to the grocery store on Fridays, always at the same time, always buying the same things. I had hands that shook slightly when I tried to thread a needle, and joints that predicted weather changes better than the meteorologists on television. My doctor had a file thick with blood work results and bone density scans and gentle suggestions about aging gracefully, a phrase that had always annoyed me because it seemed to imply that there was a graceful way to watch your body slowly betray you. I was, by all accounts, exactly what you'd expect a woman of my age to be. Careful about stairs. Cautious about ice. Sensible about my limitations. I drove slowly and parked close to building entrances and always held the handrail when going up or down steps. Invisible. That's what I had become. Not intentionally but gradually, the way you become invisible when you stop expecting to be seen. But here's what you need to understand about getting older, about moving through the world in a body that's been around for 8 decades. It's not the big moments that define your experience. It's not the milestone birthdays or the medical diagnoses or even the deaths of people you love, though all of those things matter deeply. It's the small choices you make every single day. The way you decide each morning whether to engage with the world or retreat from it. The way you choose to see yourself, as someone who still has something to give, or as someone who's already given enough. For years, I had been choosing retreat without even realizing it. Turning down invitations that seemed too complicated or too strenuous. Avoiding activities that might be physically challenging or socially demanding. Living in the same house, shopping at the same stores, following the same routes and routines that kept me safe and small and unremarkable. When did I start living like I was already a ghost? When did I begin to accept that the most interesting chapters of my life were behind me? The morning everything changed, I was sitting in my kitchen at the same table where I had fed my babies and helped my children with homework and shared 48 years of breakfasts with a man who had loved me even when I was difficult to love. The morning light was streaming through the same lace curtains I had hung in 1987, and I was drinking coffee from the same blue ceramic mug that Robert had given me for our 20th wedding anniversary. I was reading a letter that had arrived the day before, delivered in the familiar handwriting of my sister-in-law Janet. The envelope had felt heavier than usual in my hands, and I had known before opening it that it contained the kind of news that changes the shape of your world. Richard was dead. My baby brother, who had called me every Friday for 43 years, who had never forgotten my birthday, who had built a treehouse for his grandchildren even after his arthritis made it painful to grip a hammer, he was gone. The letter was full of gentle details about his final days, about how peaceful he had been, about how he had talked about our childhood right up until the end. But it was the last paragraph that stopped my heart. Margaret, Richard made me promise to tell you something. He said to remind you about the promise you made him. He said you'd know what that meant. He said to tell you that it's not too late, that it's never too late to surprise yourself. I sat in my kitchen holding that letter, and suddenly I could hear Richard's voice as clearly as if he were sitting across from me, grinning the way he used to when he was planning some adventure that would probably get us both in trouble. And I remembered the promise. The promise had been made on a cold February evening, 2 days before Richard died. I had flown to Seattle for what we both knew would be the last time, leaving behind my carefully tended garden and my organized life to sit beside a hospital bed and watch my baby brother disappear a little more each day. Richard had been fighting pancreatic cancer for 8 months by then, fighting it with the same stubborn determination he had brought to everything else in his life. He had been a carpenter, a man who built things with his hands, who could look at a pile of lumber and see the bones of a house, who had taught himself to fix engines and plumbing and anything else that broke because he couldn't stand the idea of paying someone else to do something he could figure out himself. But cancer doesn't care about your skills or your determination or your refusal to give up. Cancer follows its own timeline, makes its own rules, and by February Richard's body had become a battlefield where he was losing ground every day. I had been visiting him for 3 days, sleeping on the uncomfortable chair beside his bed and learning to interpret the language of medical equipment. The beeping that meant his heart was still beating, the whooshing that meant the oxygen was flowing, the periodic alarms that meant something needed attention but didn't necessarily mean the end was coming right now. On this particular evening, Richard had been unconscious for most of the day, his breathing shallow and labored, his face gaunt in a way that made him look like a stranger wearing my brother's skin. Janet had gone home to shower and change clothes, and I was alone with him in the dim hospital room, listening to the sounds of other people's crises echoing down the hallway. Suddenly his eyes opened. Not the confused, unfocused look I had grown accustomed to, but the clear, sharp gaze that had been uniquely Richard for 59 years. "Maggie," he whispered, his voice barely audible but perfectly lucid. "Are you still planning to do it?" I knew immediately what he meant. 3 months earlier, during one of his better days when the pain medication was working and his appetite had returned long enough for him to eat half a sandwich, we had been talking about regrets. About all the things we had always meant to do but never found the time or courage or energy for. It had started as an idle conversation, the kind of philosophical discussion that happens naturally when you're sitting in a hospital room with nothing to do but wait and remember. Richard had mentioned wanting to see the Northern Lights, something he had dreamed about since childhood but had never prioritized over more practical concerns like mortgage payments and college tuition for his kids. "I always thought I'd have time later," he had said, staring out the window at the Seattle skyline. "When the kids were older, when we had more money saved, when life wasn't so busy and complicated. But later never came, you know? There was always something else, some other responsibility or crisis or reason to postpone the things that seemed like luxuries." I understood exactly what he meant. My own list of postponed dreams was long and detailed. The pottery classes I had never taken, the garden in France I had never visited, the piano lessons I had abandoned in childhood and always meant to resume. "What about you?" he had asked. "What's on your list of things you always meant to do?" I had laughed, trying to deflect the question because it felt too heavy for a Thursday afternoon in a cancer ward. "Oh, Richard, I'm 79 years old. My list of dreams is pretty much closed for business." But he hadn't laughed. He had looked at me with those serious brown eyes that reminded me so much of our father, and he had said, "That's the biggest lie you've ever told yourself, Margaret Chin." The conversation that followed had lasted for hours, winding through memories and regrets and half-formed wishes we had never spoken aloud. We talked about the ways we had both spent so many years being responsible, being careful, being the people others expected us to be, that we had forgotten who we wanted to be. "I wanted to run a marathon," Richard had said suddenly, his voice so quiet I almost missed it. "A marathon?" I was surprised. "Richard, you haven't run since high school." He had smiled then, a shadow of his old grin. I know it sounds crazy. But I used to think about it sometimes. What it would feel like to run that far. What it would feel like to push my body to its absolute limit and then somehow find a way to keep going. What it would feel like to cross that finish line and know that I had done something bigger than myself. Something bigger than myself. The phrase had stuck with me, echoing in my mind long after the conversation moved on to other topics. "Maybe it's not too late," I had said, though we both knew it was. "It is for me," he had said quietly, accepting the reality of his situation with the same matter-of-fact grace he had brought to everything else. "But maybe it's not too late for you." I stared at him, not understanding. "Richard, I'm 79 years old. I can barely walk to the mailbox without getting winded. I haven't exercised intentionally since I took that aerobics class in 1987, and that lasted exactly 3 weeks before I decided it was too embarrassing to continue. So," he had said, and his voice had carried a hint of the mischief I remembered from our childhood. "Age is just a number, Maggie. And besides, you've got something I don't have anymore." "What's that?" "Time. And perfectly good legs that still work." The idea had seemed absurd then, sitting in that sterile hospital room surrounded by the apparatus of modern medicine and the unmistakable reality of human fragility. Me running a marathon? I was a woman who took elevators to the second floor, who drove to the corner store even when the weather was beautiful, who had made peace with the gradual diminishment that seemed to be the inevitable price of growing older. But Richard had been persistent in the way that only dying people can be persistent, with the urgency of someone who knows his time for influencing the world is running out. "Promise me something," he had said, reaching for my hand with fingers that were thin and cold but still strong enough to squeeze. "Anything. Promise me you'll stop living like you're already dead. Promise me you'll do something that scares you. Something that makes you feel alive. Something that proves to yourself that your story isn't over yet." Now, sitting alone with him in that dim hospital room 2 days before he died, Richard was asking if I still planned to keep that promise. And the honest answer was that I had never planned to keep it. I had made it because that's what you do when your brother is dying. You promise impossible things, you make commitments you don't know how to keep, you say yes to anything that might bring comfort or hope or meaning to the time you have left together. But I never thought I'd actually do it. "I don't know," I whispered back, leaning close so he could hear me. "Richard, you know I'm not the kind of person who does things like that." He was quiet for a long moment, and I thought he might have fallen back into the medicated sleep that claimed him more and more frequently. But then he spoke again, his voice so soft I had to strain to hear it. "Remember when you taught me to ride a bike?" he asked. I remembered. I was 12 and he was 7, and our father had been too busy and our mother had been too nervous, so the job had fallen to me. I remembered the way Richard had looked over his shoulder at me, his eyes wide with terror and excitement as I ran alongside him, holding onto the seat of his small red bicycle. I remembered the moment I finally let go, the way he had wobbled for a few seconds before finding his balance. I remembered how he had ridden in circles around our driveway, laughing and shouting, "I'm doing it, Maggie. I'm really doing it." "You never let go too early," he said now, his voice carrying across 45 years as if that afternoon had happened yesterday. "You always made sure I was ready. You always believed I could do it even when I didn't believe it myself. Now I'm the one who's scared of falling. I believed in you because you were my little brother," I said. "It was my job to believe in you. And now," he said, "it's your job to believe in yourself." He closed his eyes then and I thought the conversation was over. But as I was starting to pull my hand away, he squeezed it one more time. "Promise me, Maggie. Promise me you'll try." So I promised. Because that's what you do when your baby brother is asking you for something that might be the last thing he ever asks for. You promise even when you don't know how to keep the promise. You say yes even when yes feels impossible. "I promise, Richard. I'll try." He died 2 days later, on a Tuesday morning with the Seattle rain pattering against his window and Janet holding his other hand. His last words, according to Janet, were about me. "Tell Maggie to remember," he had whispered. "Tell her it's not too late to surprise herself." The first time I tried to run, I lasted exactly 37 seconds. I know the precise timing because I was watching the second hand on my wristwatch. The same watch Robert had given me for our 25th anniversary, counting each step and each breath like they were precious commodities. Which I suppose they were. 37 seconds of what could generously be called jogging, though it was really more like an enthusiastic shuffle, before my lungs felt like they were on fire and my legs felt like they belonged to someone else entirely. I stopped in the middle of the sidewalk 3 blocks from my house, gasping and embarrassed and hoping none of my neighbors were watching through their windows and wondering if Mrs. Chin had finally lost her mind. What am I doing? This is ridiculous. I'm 79 years old, not 17. But I went out the next day anyway. And the day after that. Each time pushing myself a few seconds longer, a few steps farther, each time feeling like I was asking my body to do something it had never been designed for. The hardest part wasn't the physical discomfort, though there was plenty of that. The hardest part was the voice in my head, not Richard's encouraging voice, but my own practical, sensible voice that had kept me safe and reasonable for nearly 8 decades. "This is embarrassing. People are staring. You look like a fool. You're too old for this. You're going to hurt yourself. What if you have a heart attack? What if you fall? What if someone sees you struggling and calls an ambulance? Your children are going to think you've lost your mind." That last thought turned out to be prophetic. 3 weeks into my tentative attempts at running, I made the mistake of mentioning my new activity to my daughter Sarah during our regular Sunday phone call. "You're doing what?" she said, her voice sharp with the kind of alarm usually reserved for natural disasters or medical emergencies. Running, I repeated, though even saying the word felt presumptuous. While trying to run. Mostly I'm walking very fast and occasionally breaking into something that might technically qualify as jogging. The silence on the other end of the line stretched so long that I thought we might have been disconnected. Mom, she finally said, her voice carefully controlled in the way that suggested she was trying very hard not to sound hysterical. Are you having some kind of breakdown? Because if you are, it's okay. We can get you help. There are people who specialize in helping seniors adjust to. I'm not having a breakdown, I interrupted. I'm having a breakthrough. But Sarah wasn't convinced. Over the next few days I received concerned phone calls from all three of my children. They used words like dangerous and unrealistic, and setting yourself up for disappointment. They talked about my age, my health, and my complete lack of athletic experience. They spoke in the gentle, patronizing tones people use with elderly relatives who have started doing things that don't make sense. My son David was the most direct. Mom, you're 79 years old. Your idea of exercise for the past 20 years has been gardening. Now you want to run a marathon? Do you understand how crazy that sounds? It sounds like a promise I made to your uncle, I said. Uncle Richard was dying, David said, his voice softer but no less concerned. People say things when they're dying. They make requests that don't always make sense. That doesn't mean you have to. Yes, I interrupted. It does mean I have to. They meant well. They loved me. But they couldn't understand that this wasn't about athletics or achievement or proving anything to anyone else. This was about keeping a promise to my dead brother. This was about discovering whether there was still something alive and vital inside a body that everyone, including me, had written off as past its expiration date. They want me to die quietly, I realized during one particularly intense conversation with my youngest daughter Linda. Not literally, but they want me to fade away gracefully, to become smaller and smaller until I disappear entirely. The first real setback came 3 weeks into my training. I was attempting what I generously called a run, really more of an enthusiastic walk with occasional bursts of something resembling jogging, when I felt a sharp pain shoot through my right knee. Not the dull ache I had grown accustomed to, but something sharper, more immediate, more frightening. I limped home and spent the next 2 days on my couch with ice packs and ibuprofen, convinced that my brief running career was over before it had really begun. My body, I thought, was sending me a very clear message. You're too old for this nonsense. Accept your limitations and stick to activities appropriate for someone your age. But on the third day, something unexpected happened. My granddaughter Emma called. Emma was 22, a senior in college studying physical therapy, and the only family member who had never tried to talk me out of my marathon goal. In fact, she was the only one who seemed to think it was anything other than evidence of senility or a midlife crisis 30 years too late. Grandma, she said after I had told her about my knee injury, can I ask you something? Of course, sweetheart. Why is this so important to you? I mean, I think it's awesome and everything, but why a marathon? Why not just walk around the block and call it good? It was a fair question, and I found myself struggling to find words that would make sense to someone who had never felt invisible, who had never experienced the gradual shrinking that comes with age, who still believed that her life was full of unlimited possibilities. Because, I said finally, your Uncle Richard asked me to prove that I was still alive. And running 26 miles seems like pretty definitive proof. Emma was quiet for a moment, processing this. Then she said something that changed everything. Can I help? That simple question transformed my lonely, embarrassing struggle into something that felt like a team effort. Emma drove down from her college the following weekend and went with me to see Dr. Martinez, the same family physician who had been gently managing my various age-related ailments for the past 15 years. Dr. Martinez examined my knee with the kind of thoroughness that suggested he was looking for reasons to forbid me from continuing. He ordered x-rays and blood work and a stress test that left me exhausted but oddly exhilarated. When all the results came back, he called me into his office with the weary expression of a man who had delivered difficult news many times before. Margaret, he said, settling back in his chair and opening a file that seemed to contain an alarming amount of information about my aging body. I'm going to be honest with you. Your knee is inflamed, your bone density is concerning for someone your age, and your cardiovascular fitness is, well, it's exactly what I'd expect from someone who has been sedentary for most of her adult life. So you're telling me to quit? I'm telling you to be realistic. Marathon running is an extreme sport even for people half your age. The risk of injury, of heart problems, of... He paused, choosing his words carefully. The risk of serious harm is significant. I sat in that sterile examination room, surrounded by posters about blood pressure and flu vaccines and the importance of regular cancer screenings, and I felt the weight of everyone's expectations pressing down on me. The expectation that I would be sensible, that I would act my age, that I would accept the limitations that everyone else could see so clearly. But then I thought about Richard lying in that hospital bed, asking me to promise him something impossible. I thought about all the small ways I had been disappearing over the years, all the times I had chosen safety over possibility, caution over adventure. Richard couldn't see the finish line either, and he never stopped believing he could get there. "Doctor," I said, looking him directly in the eyes, "if I promise to start slowly, to listen to my body, to come see you if anything feels wrong, will you help me instead of trying to stop me?" He stared at me for a long moment, and I could see him weighing his professional caution against something that might have been admiration or curiosity, or the kind of respect you develop for people who refuse to be talked out of their dreams. "Against my better judgment," he said finally, "yes. But we're going to do this very, very carefully." That appointment led to others. Consultations with a physical therapist named Marcus who designed exercises to strengthen my knees and hips and core muscles I didn't even know I had. Sessions with a nutritionist named Dr. Patel who explained how to fuel my body for the demands I was placing on it, what to eat before long runs, how to stay hydrated, which supplements might help my aging bones handle the stress of repetitive impact. Most importantly, it led to a meeting with a running coach named Maria Santos who specialized in working with older athletes, though she admitted I was by far the oldest client she had ever taken on. Maria was 53, with graying hair and laugh lines around her eyes, and she was the first person who didn't look at me like I was delusional. "I've worked with runners in their 70s, she told me during our first meeting at a coffee shop near the local high school track. Even a few in their early 80s. It's not about age, it's about preparation and patience and listening to your body." She designed a training program that started with walking and gradually introduced short intervals of jogging. She taught me about stretching and recovery and the importance of rest days. She explained the difference between good pain and bad pain, between the discomfort of muscles adapting to new demands and the warning signals of potential injury. Most importantly, she taught me that progress wasn't always linear, that there would be setbacks and plateaus and days when everything hurt and I would question my sanity. "The goal isn't to become a fast runner," she explained, spreading out a training calendar that looked simultaneously encouraging and terrifying. "The goal is to become a runner who can finish. There's a big difference. Finishing. That's all Richard ever wanted, to finish something big, something meaningful, something that proved he had been here." The training became the organizing principle of my life. I woke up each morning and put on those bright blue running shoes, the most expensive footwear I had ever owned, before I could talk myself out of it. I learned to recognize the difference between the discomfort of exertion and the pain of injury. I discovered muscles I hadn't known I possessed and gradually coaxed them into cooperation. Emma became my training partner whenever she could get away from school, running beside me during some of my longer workouts and cheering me on during the ones that felt impossible. She researched nutrition and recovery techniques, downloaded apps that tracked my mileage and pace, and sent me encouraging text messages on days when I felt like quitting. But even with Emma's support and Maria's expertise and Dr. Martinez's reluctant medical supervision, the doubts never completely disappeared. There were nights when I lay in bed, my body aching from the day's training, wondering if my children were right. Wondering if I was being reckless or selfish or foolish. Wondering if Richard would have wanted me to put myself through this. But then I would remember his voice. "You never let go too early, Maggie. You always made sure I was ready." The physical progress was slower than I had hoped but more dramatic than I had expected. After 6 months of training, I could run for 10 minutes without stopping, a distance that would have seemed impossible when I started. After a year, I completed my first 5K race, finishing dead last but finishing nonetheless. The medal they gave me was cheap plastic, but I wore it around the house for a week and slept with it on my nightstand. Richard would have been so proud. Each milestone brought new challenges and new discoveries about what my body could do when I stopped telling it what it couldn't do. The day I ran for 30 minutes straight. The morning I completed my first 10K training run. The afternoon I realized I was actually looking forward to my daily runs instead of dreading them. But the biggest revelation came during a conversation with Maria about 18 months into my training. We were sitting in her car after a particularly challenging workout, and I was feeling discouraged because my pace had been slower than usual. "Margaret," she said, watching me frown at my stopwatch, "do you know what you've accomplished?" "What do you mean?" 18 months ago you couldn't run for a minute without stopping. Today you ran for 45 minutes. Do you understand how extraordinary that is for someone your age? I hadn't thought about it that way. I had been so focused on the distance still ahead, the marathon was still 6 months away, that I hadn't fully appreciated the distance I had already traveled. I had become a runner. At 80 years old I had become someone who ran. The thought should have filled me with pride, but instead it made me miss Richard so intensely that I started crying right there in Maria's car. He should have been there to see this. He should have been able to watch his big sister transform from someone who got winded walking upstairs into someone who could run for miles. "He would be so proud of you," Maria said softly, somehow understanding without being told what my tears were about. "I hope so," I whispered. "I really hope so." Race day dawned gray and cold, with a bitter October wind that cut through my carefully chosen layers of clothing and made me question every decision that had brought me to this moment. I stood in the staging area at 6 a.m., surrounded by thousands of other runners, young bodies in sleek athletic gear, muscles that had been trained for years, hearts that had never needed medication to maintain a steady rhythm. What am I doing here? The question had been echoing in my mind since I woke up at 4:30 a.m., too nervous to sleep any longer. I had eaten the breakfast Maria had prescribed, oatmeal with banana and honey, exactly what I had been eating before long training runs for months. I had applied the anti-chafing balm to all the places where fabric might rub against skin during 26 miles of movement. I had pinned my race number to my shirt with the safety pins they provided, though my hands were shaking so badly that Emma had to help me. Emma, my 22-year-old granddaughter who had run alongside me for the past 8 months, who could have easily completed this marathon in under 4 hours but had promised to stay with me no matter how long it took. She found me in the crowd of runners, her face bright with excitement and nerves, bouncing slightly on her toes in the way that athletes do when they're trying to stay loose and warm. "You ready, Grandma?" she asked, though I could see in her eyes that she was asking herself the same question about me that I was asking about myself. Ready? Was anyone ever really ready for something like this? Was Richard ready when the cancer started growing in his pancreas, turning his body into a battlefield where he would ultimately lose every fight? Was I ready when the doctor first told me that my bones were getting thinner and my heart was working harder and my time for big adventures was probably behind me? Ready or not, Richard, here we go. The starting gun fired at 7 a.m. sharp, and we began moving forward in the great river of humanity that stretched for blocks ahead of us. For the first few miles I felt strong. My legs moved in the rhythm I had practiced thousands of times during training, my breathing was steady and controlled, and the crowd's energy carried me forward like a tide. Emma ran beside me, chattering about the other runners, pointing out costumes and signs and spectacular crashes, keeping my mind off the daunting distance that stretched ahead. Maria was somewhere along the course with her car, ready to provide support if I needed it. My children, despite their ongoing concerns about my sanity, had promised to be at the finish line. Everything is going according to plan. But marathons, I learned, don't care about your plans. At mile 5, I noticed the first hint of discomfort in my right hip. Not pain exactly, but a stiffness that hadn't been there during training runs. I adjusted my stride slightly and kept going. At mile 8, I felt the first twinge in my right knee, the same knee that had given me trouble during the early days of training. I slowed my pace slightly, telling myself it was just the cold morning air making my joints protest. At mile 10, the twinge had become a sharp pain that shot up my leg with every step. I stopped at a water station and tried to stretch, but the pain was getting worse instead of better. "Grandma," Emma said, her voice tight with worry that she was trying to hide behind forced cheerfulness, "how are you feeling? Do you need to?" "I'm fine," I interrupted, though we both knew I wasn't. "Just a little stiff. It'll work itself out." But it wasn't working itself out. At mile 12 I realized I was in serious trouble. The pain in my knee was constant now, and I could feel something wrong in my left hip as well. A grinding sensation that suggested things were not moving the way they were supposed to move. My pace had slowed to barely faster than a fast walk. and other runners were streaming past us in an endless flow of younger, stronger, better-prepared bodies. "Emma," I said, stopping beside the course where volunteers were handing out sports drinks and energy gels, "you should go on without me." She looked at me like I had suggested she abandon a wounded animal on the side of the road. "Are you insane? I'm not leaving you. You could still finish in a good time," I said, watching a group of women who looked to be about Emma's age jog past us, their conversation easy and their breathing unlabored. "You've trained for this. You deserve to." "Grandma." Her voice was firm in a way that reminded me of her mother at that age and her grandmother at that age and probably myself at that age. "I didn't train for this to get a good time. I trained for this to run with you. So we're running together or we're quitting together. Your choice. Your choice." I looked around at the other runners, at the spectators lining the course with their signs and their cowbells and their enthusiastic cheering for complete strangers, at the medical volunteers who were starting to eye me with the kind of professional concern that suggested they were getting ready to intervene. I thought about my children somewhere ahead at the finish line, probably checking their phones and wondering if they should start worrying yet. I thought about Maria tracking my progress through the app on her phone and hoping I would prove that her faith in me hadn't been misplaced. But mostly I thought about Richard. About the promise I had made to him in that sterile hospital room 2 days before he died. About the look in his eyes when he asked me to do something that scared me, something that proved I was still alive. "This scares me, Richard. God, this scares me more than anything I've ever done." "We keep going," I said. The next 14 miles were the longest of my life. Each step was a negotiation between my will and my body, between the promise I had made and the pain that was trying to break it. Emma stayed beside me, adjusting her pace to match mine as I got slower and slower, chatting about everything and nothing to keep my mind off the growing certainty that I was asking my body to do something it simply couldn't do. At mile 16 I was moving so slowly that the race officials were starting to look concerned. The volunteers at the water stations were asking if I needed medical attention. Other runners were offering encouragement, but I could see the doubt in their eyes. The question of whether this elderly woman should even be attempting something so far beyond her apparent capabilities. Maybe they're right. Maybe this was always impossible. At mile 18 I hit what runners call the wall. The point where your body wants to quit, where every step becomes an act of will rather than muscle memory. But for me the wall wasn't just physical exhaustion. It was the accumulated weight of 80 years of being told what I couldn't do, what wasn't appropriate for someone my age, what wasn't realistic to expect from a body that had already lived most of its useful life. This is where most people would stop. This is where most people would accept that they had pushed themselves as far as they could reasonably go. But I thought about Richard lying in that hospital bed, asking me to promise him something impossible. I thought about all the small ways I had been disappearing over the years, all the times I had chosen safety over possibility, caution over adventure. I thought about the woman I had been before I started running. Careful, invisible, already half gone. Not yet. My story isn't finished yet. At mile 20 Emma was crying, tears of exhaustion and worry and something that might have been pride. "Grandma," she whispered, "I can't believe you're still going." Neither could I. At mile 22 I was barely moving. Other runners were walking now too, their bodies also reaching the limits of endurance, but they were young enough and strong enough to recover. I was moving forward on pure stubbornness and the echo of my brother's voice. "You never let go too early, Maggie." At mile 24 I could see the crowds thickening ahead of us. Somewhere in that mass of people was the finish line. Somewhere up there was the end of this impossible journey that had started with a promise made to a dying man and had somehow become the most important thing I had ever attempted. At mile 25, with just over a mile to go, I stopped. Not because I wanted to. Not because I had made a conscious decision to quit. I stopped because my body simply refused to take another step. I stood in the middle of the course, swaying slightly, while Emma grabbed my arm to steady me and a small crowd of concerned runners and volunteers began to gather around us. "Grandma? Grandma, talk to me." But I couldn't talk. I couldn't think clearly. Everything was gray around the edges, and the sound of the crowd seemed to be coming from very far away. I was aware of people asking if I was okay, of someone calling for medical assistance, of Emma's voice getting increasingly panicked. "This is it. This is where it ends. I'm going to collapse a mile from the finish line, and everyone will say they knew this would happen. Everyone will say I should have listened, should have been realistic, should have acted my age." But then I heard something that cut through the gray fog in my mind. A voice I recognized, though it couldn't possibly be there. Come on, Maggie. You're almost home. Richard. I opened my eyes and saw Emma's face, streaked with tears and fierce with determination. Behind her, a small crowd of runners had stopped to help. Strangers who had no reason to care about one old woman's impossible dream but who somehow understood that this moment mattered. Behind them, the finish line banner was visible in the distance. 1 mile. Just one more mile. Richard ran out of miles, but I haven't. Not yet. I took a step forward. Then another. Emma stayed beside me and several of the other runners stayed too, forming a protective circle around us as we moved toward the finish line at a pace that was barely faster than walking but was still technically forward progress. With half a mile to go, I could hear the announcer's voice over the loudspeaker, though I couldn't make out the specific words through the roaring in my ears. The crowds were thicker here and people were cheering for everyone who passed, but it felt like some of those cheers were specifically for us. For the old woman who was refusing to quit and the young woman who refused to leave her behind. With a quarter mile to go, I could see individual faces in the crowd. Children holding homemade signs, families waiting for their runners, volunteers handing out medals and space blankets. Somewhere in that crowd, my children were waiting, probably torn between pride and terror. With 1/10 of a mile to go, I could see the actual finish line. The blue and orange banner stretched across the street like a birthday ribbon, the word "finish" in bold letters that seemed to pulse with every labored heartbeat. We're going to make it, Richard. We're actually going to make it. That's when my legs finally gave out completely. I felt myself falling forward, felt Emma's hands trying to catch me, felt the asphalt rushing up to meet me. The last thing I remember clearly was the paramedic's gentle hands and her kind eyes, so much like Emma's, so much like Richard's had been in those final days. Margaret, what made you think you could run a marathon at your age? And I knew the answer even as they loaded me onto the stretcher. Even as the crowd parted around us. Even as the finish line banner grew smaller in the distance. Because someone I loved believed I could. Because someone who couldn't run anymore asked me to run for both of us. Because keeping promises to the dead is more important than protecting the living from disappointment. I woke up in the hospital 4 hours later to find my entire family crowded into a room that was barely big enough for the bed and one visitor's chair. Sarah was holding my left hand, David was pacing by the window like a caged animal, and Linda was arguing in whispered tones with a doctor who looked like he was losing patience with family members who clearly wanted to blame someone for their mother's collapse. But it was Emma I looked for first, and I found her sitting in the corner, still wearing her race number and her finisher's medal, her eyes red-rimmed but bright with something that looked like triumph. "Did you?" I asked, my voice scratchy from the oxygen mask they'd had me on. "We finished," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "All of us. They let me go back and help you across the line after the paramedics said you were stable. 26.2 miles, Grandma. We did it." I closed my eyes and felt something that might have been relief or exhaustion, or the deepest satisfaction I had ever experienced. We did it. Against all odds, against all advice, against all reasonable expectations, we had actually done it. Richard, we kept the promise. The doctor, Dr. Peterson, according to his name tag, approached my bed with the kind of expression that suggested he had some things to say about 80-year-old women attempting to run marathons. "Mrs. Chen," he began, consulting a chart that seemed to contain an alarming amount of information about my body's recent rebellion, "I want you to understand how lucky you are. You experienced severe dehydration, dangerous electrolyte imbalances, and what we call rhabdomyolysis. Essentially, your muscles were breaking down from the extreme exertion. If you had been alone, if the medical team hadn't been there immediately, this could have been much worse." I nodded, understanding the seriousness of what he was telling me. But I also understood something else. "But I finished," I said. He stared at me for a moment, and I could see him trying to decide whether to lecture me further about the dangers of extreme exercise at my age or simply shake his head in amazement at the stubborn determination of elderly patients. "Yes," he said finally. "You finished. In 8 hours and 43 minutes, which I'm told is actually quite respectable for someone who was unconscious for the last 50 yards. My children didn't share the doctor's reluctant admiration. Over the next few days as I recovered in the hospital and then at home, they took turns expressing their feelings about what I had put them through. "Mom," David said during one particularly intense conversation, "we thought we were going to lose you. Do you understand that? We thought we were going to watch our mother die trying to prove some point that didn't need to be proven. What point was I trying to prove? I asked. I don't know, he said, throwing his hands up in frustration that had been building for 3 years. That you're still young? That age doesn't matter? That you can do anything you set your mind to? I don't know what you were trying to prove, but it wasn't worth risking your life for. But that's exactly what it was worth, I thought. That's exactly what Richard understood that the rest of you don't. I tried to explain it to them over the following weeks. I tried to tell them about the promise I had made to their uncle, about the way I had been disappearing a little more each year, about how the marathon had given me something I hadn't even realized I was missing. But they couldn't hear it. All they could see was their elderly mother who had nearly killed herself doing something dangerous and unnecessary. Maybe you have to be close to the end to understand the importance of feeling fully alive. But the real understanding came from unexpected sources. Emma, who had run every step beside me and who now wore her finisher's medal to school every day, telling anyone who would listen about her grandmother who had run a marathon at 80. Maria, who sent me a card that read, "You didn't just finish a marathon. You redefined what finishing means." Dr. Martinez, who admitted during a follow-up appointment that watching me train had inspired him to start running again after 20 years of making excuses about being too busy. But the most meaningful responses came in letters from strangers who had read about my marathon in the local newspaper. The article had been picked up by other papers, then by running magazines, then by websites devoted to inspirational stories and senior fitness. Dear Mrs. Chin, I am 74 years old and for the past 3 years, I have been telling myself that my adventurous days are behind me. I've been telling myself that it's too late to learn new things, to challenge myself, to surprise anyone, including myself. Then I read about your marathon and I realized that I've been lying to myself. Yesterday I signed up for a pottery class. It's not running 26 miles, but for me it's a start. Thank you for showing me that our stories don't have to end just because we're getting older. Thank you for proving that it's never too late to begin again. Sincerely, Patricia Steinberg. I received dozens of letters like Patricia's over the following months. From people who had started exercise programs, who had gone back to school, who had begun new relationships or new careers or new adventures because they had seen an 80-year-old woman refuse to accept that her interesting days were behind her. This is what Richard understood. This is what he was asking me to prove, not just to myself but to everyone who thinks that getting older means giving up. 6 months after the marathon, I was back to my regular training routine. Shorter distances now, gentler paces, but still running 3 times a week. My children had gradually accepted that this wasn't a phase or a crisis, but simply who their mother had become. Emma was training for her second marathon, and she had convinced 2 of her college friends to join her. I had become someone who inspired other people to run toward their dreams instead of away from them. 1 year after the marathon, on the anniversary of Richard's death, I received a package from Janet. Inside was a photo I had never seen before. A picture of Richard at age 17, crossing the finish line of his high school's annual 5K race. He was smiling, his arms raised in victory, his whole face lit up with the joy of someone who had just discovered what his body could do when he stopped listening to the voices that told him what it couldn't do. The note with the photo was brief. Margaret, I found this in Richard's things while cleaning out the attic. I think he would want you to have it. He always said you were the strongest person he knew, but I don't think even he imagined you were this strong. Thank you for keeping your promise. Thank you for running for both of you. Love, Janet. I put the photo on my mantle next to my marathon medal and the letter from Patricia Steinberg and a growing collection of similar letters from people who had found their own ways to surprise themselves. 3 pieces of evidence that life doesn't end when you get older. It just gets more precious, more urgent, more worth fighting for. Richard was right. I did have something he didn't have anymore. I had time. And I had finally learned not to waste it on being careful. 2 years after the marathon, I'm still running. Not training for another 26.2-mile race. I think 1 marathon at my age is proof enough of whatever needs to be proven. But running because it has become part of who I am, part of how I move through the world, part of how I honor the promise I made to my brother and the promises I make to myself every morning when I lace up those bright blue shoes. I run because it reminds me that I'm still here, still capable of surprising myself, still writing chapters in a story that other people assumed was finished. I run because it connects me to something larger than my daily routines and medical appointments and the gradual diminishments that come with age. But mostly I run because every step is a conversation with Richard, A way of staying connected to someone who believed in me even when I didn't believe in myself. Every mile is proof that love doesn't end when someone dies. It just changes form, becomes something you carry forward instead of something you share in the present moment. And sometimes, if you listen carefully while you're running through the early morning streets, you can hear the voice of someone who isn't there anymore, cheering you on, reminding you that you never let go too early, that you always make sure people are ready before you release them into their own possibilities. If you've made it this far, thank you for walking this road with me. I hope this story gave you strength, or at least the feeling that you're not alone. Comment where you're watching from and maybe subscribe. Let's build a place where voices like mine, and maybe even yours, are finally heard.